Every once in a while, you come across a case that is so bizarre, so unlike anything you've ever heard before, it's hard to believe that it really happened. Today, we're discussing one of those cases. It begins with a wife and mother going out to get her mail like any other day and opening a letter that would begin a chain of events that would ruin many lives in this small, previously peaceful town. I'm Olivia LaVoice, creator and host of the Casefile Presents podcast, The Bakersfield 3. I've teamed up with Casefile to bring you their stories in a new format. Casey and I have picked some of Casefile's most memorable cases to be featured here, where the storytelling will be a bit different. Mainly, you'll have photos and videos guiding you through the case. Today's story is based on case number 266, the Circleville writer. On behalf of Casefile, we want to give a special thank you to author, journalist, and private investigator Martin Yant for his help in putting together this wild story. Now, it all began in the quaint town of Circleville, Ohio, that prior to this case was most well known for its annual pumpkin show. It's the type of place you hear described as a tight-knit community where neighbors are close and people don't lock their doors. It's a place where people feel safe raising a family, like the Gillespies. One morning in 1977, 33-year-old Mary Gillespie opened her mailbox and saw a letter addressed to her in distinct, blocky, thick handwriting. There was no return address. Inside the envelope was a letter that read in part, "I know where you live. I've been observing your house and know you have children. This is no joke. Please take it serious. And everything will be over soon." What perhaps made this letter even more chilling was the fact that Mary and her family lived in an isolated area in their very small town on a farm. Their farmhouse was the only home on the street, surrounded by acres and acres of land. There was also more to the letter, something quite specific, an instruction of sorts. The first line of it read, "Stay away from Massie. Don't lie when questioned about knowing him." Mary knew the letter was referring to her colleague, Gordon Massie. Massie was the Logan School District superintendent. Mary was a school bus driver for the district. And shortly before the letter surfaced, Mary found out there was a rumor going around the small town of Circleville that she and Massie were having an affair. And now this letter was clearly taking this rumor as fact and warning Mary she better break off the affair with her married colleague. But it also told her to report him to the school board. The only thing that Mary could tell from the letter was that it was postmarked in Columbus, Ohio, 30 miles away, and that the blocky, thick handwriting was distinct, but not familiar to her. Mary was disturbed but wanted to brush it off, so she didn't tell anyone about it and tried to go on with her life. But a week later, that distinctive handwriting was back. This new letter to Mary read, "Lady, this is your last chance to report him. I know you are a pig and will prove it and shame you out of Ohio. Pigs sneak around and meet other women's husbands behind their backs and cause families and homes and marriages to suffer." The letter then mentioned Mary's 8-year-old daughter, saying, quote, "How is your little girl? Will she grow up to be like you?" But once again, Mary wanted to ignore it and told no one about the letter. But she wouldn't be able to keep it a secret for long. 1 week later, Mary's husband Ron was at work at a glass plate factory when a letter showed up for him in that same thick, blocky handwriting. The anonymous letter told Ron that Mary had been sleeping with the school superintendent and said, quote, "You should catch them together and kill them both." Naturally, Ron's next move was to confront his wife Mary, who was adamant the accusation about her and the affair was not true. She came clean about the 2 letters she had gotten from the undoubtedly same person. In addition to the matching handwriting, all 3 letters were riddled with spelling and grammar errors. The writer also had an odd habit of using semicolons instead of periods. Incredibly, Ron and Mary decided not to say a word to anyone about the letters. They were concerned that reporting them might add to the gossip about Mary being unfaithful. But 2 weeks later, a letter came addressed to Mary's husband, Ron Gillespie. You have had 2 weeks and done nothing. You are a pig defender. You are also a pig. Make her admit the truth and inform the school board. If not, I will broadcast it on posters, signs, billboards until the truth comes out. Good hunting in your red and white truck on your way to work. Let her read this. It's no lie. I followed her and Massie for 2 weeks and have seen her meet him several times. He knows what I want. When he quits, I'll go away. Your life is in danger. And this time, the letter did have a return address. It was to none other than the superintendent, Massie, which appeared to be the writer just toying with Ron and Mary. Now, it was the mention of Ron's red and white truck that made it clear. The writer was watching them. This is the push the couple needed to file a report with law enforcement. But reporting the letters to the sheriff's department didn't help. They kept coming, and they were escalating to disturbing threats against Ron and Mary's 8-year-old daughter. One letter read, "I shall come out there and put a bullet in that little girl's head." And then the sheriff got a call from Superintendent Massie. It turned out he had also been getting letters and trying to ignore them. The first note to Massie came 2 weeks before Mary found a letter in her mailbox. Massie's letter in this entire case is thoroughly reported on by Marie Mayhew in her podcast, Whatever Remains. In her series on the case, Mayhew describes that Massie's first letter accused him of harassing numerous female bus drivers. Remember, Mary was a school bus driver. The letter read in part, "To prey on another man's girl is untouchable, especially when they're out trying to make a living. I suggest you find yourself a pimple-faced whore and start up with her and leave my girls alone." The sheriff also discovered that not long after Massie got a letter, so did numerous members of the local Board of Education and the superintendent of another nearby district. All of the letters demanded that Massie resign and leave female bus drivers alone. The sheriff couldn't find any information that supported the letter writer's claims of Massie acting inappropriately with any bus drivers or colleagues in general. And so it seemed everyone agreed. Massie was not going to step down. Now here is where the letter writer turned things up a notch. Mary was driving her school bus one morning when she noticed numerous signs put up along the side of the road on her usual route. The signs were vulgar and of course accused Mary and the superintendent of having an affair. And this part is very disturbing. One of the signs said that Mary's child, her very young daughter, was also romantically involved with the superintendent. So now this person is targeting a child publicly and calling the superintendent a pedophile. And this is a really sad image to think of. Ron, who was trying to protect his wife and daughter, started waking up very early every single day to go drive around town looking for new signs and tearing them down before other people in town woke up and got on the road. Needless to say, the harassment was starting to take a massive toll on Ron and Mary, who were constantly looking over their shoulder, waiting for the next threat. And the hits kept on coming. More letters, more signs, and Ron and Mary began to feel that the sheriff's office really wasn't doing anything. So Ron enlisted the help of his sister Karen and his brother-in-law Paul. Paul was a former correctional officer and known for helping de-escalate things during prison riots. So Paul thought he might be able to use those same tactics with the letter writer, particularly when Paul learned that Ron and Mary had a suspect in mind. Now, while they didn't have proof, Ron and Mary told Paul they were pretty sure that the writer was another bus driver named David. See, before the letters began, this bus driver made an advance towards Mary, despite knowing that she was married. Mary rejected the bus driver, and it seemed he never quite got over that. It seemed to Mary that he had held a grudge. So one day, Mary, Ron, Ron's sister Karen, and Ron's brother-in-law Paul sat around together and formed a plan. Together, they helped Paul write a letter to their suspect, the other school bus driver. The letter wasn't violent, but it sternly told this man to stop. And initially, it seemed that this may have worked. The letters stopped coming. The writer was leaving them alone, or so it seemed. Spring turned to summer. 5 months had gone by since Mary received that first horrible letter. With the nightmare seemingly over, Mary and her sister-in-law, Ron's sister Karen, decided to go out of town for a much-needed vacation. Ron stayed at home with the kids. And that's when late that night, their home phone rang. Ron and Mary's kids observed that while the phone call seemed brief, it had clearly upset their dad, who slammed the phone down after silently listening to whoever was on the other end. After hanging up, Ron grabbed his gun and kissed his children goodbye. He told them the letter writer had just called and he would be back soon. Ron got in his truck and drove off into the darkness. 30 minutes later, a call came into the sheriff's office. The caller was frantic and said there'd been a terrible accident. The crash site was about 7 miles from Ron and Mary's home. Deputies found Ron's smashed truck. It had appeared Ron had crashed head-on into a tree, driving at a high speed. Ron had died. Investigators quickly concluded this was a tragic accident. The roads were dark, Ron wasn't wearing a seatbelt, and had been speeding. The county coroner decided there was no need for an autopsy or further investigation. But for Ron's heartbroken family, it was not that cut and dry. For one thing, the revolver he had grabbed before running out of the house was missing a bullet. They could tell that one had been fired, but couldn't locate it. Ron's family also suspected that Ron may have been chasing someone. See, Ron knew these roads like the back of his hand. So a high-speed chase seemed most probable to them as to how he could lose control of the wheel. Ron's brother-in-law, Paul, was particularly vocal about being upset with the local sheriff for not investigating Ron's death as suspicious. Though the sheriff did reportedly spend some time looking into the possibility of foul play, the case was ruled an accident and closed. The only thing that seemed clear about Ron's death was it had caused the Circleville writer to stop. As the years went by after Ron's death with no more letters coming, a couple marriages in the small town of Circleville crumbled. Ron's sister Karen divorced his brother-in-law Paul, and the wife of Superintendent Massie also filed for divorce. Once Massie's divorce was finalized, there was a new couple in town. Superintendent Massie and Ron's widow Mary began officially dating. This is pretty crazy, of course, because their relationship seemed to solidify all of those rumors about them having an affair. But Mary was adamant that nothing romantic ever happened between the two of them until several years after her husband Ron died and Massie's wife filed for divorce. And while years went by without any letters, eventually they began to resurface. And supposedly there were various other residents of Circleville who were getting these crazy letters. But it seems they really weren't investigated. And then just before Christmas 1982, 5 years after the first letter was sent and Ron died, Mary received an anonymous letter with an unexpected threat. The writer told Mary she had 3 months to marry Superintendent Massie, who she was now dating. It concluded that if the couple wasn't married by March 1st, 1983, that Mary would find signs along her bus route about her young daughter. 2 months later, though there was still a month left to make good on the writer's demand, it seems the Circleville writer ran out of patience. One morning, as Mary drove her school bus near an area where her husband Ron had died 5 years earlier, she saw a large sign that targeted her now 13-year-old daughter. As some of the signs had said in the past, this one was referring to her daughter and Superintendent Massie, her now boyfriend, making shocking, horrific allegations, again, essentially accusing Massie of being a pedophile. Mary, of course, grabbed the sign. She pulled it out of the dirt by the wooden stake and put it in her school bus. Later that day, Mary took a closer look at the sign and noticed there was a black box of sorts made out of cardboard behind the actual sign. Mary tore it open and found what she believed to be a fake handgun. Now, despite the seemingly low interest from the sheriff's department to continue investigating the Circleville letter writer, Mary handed over the replica handgun to deputies. That's when they told her This gun was not fake. Not only was this a very real .25 caliber pistol, but investigators told Mary that the gun had been meant to be a booby trap. The gun was loaded and a tripwire was tied around the handle of the trigger. Whoever had done this had planned for the gun to go off when the cardboard box attached to the sign was ripped open. Investigators told Mary that her decision to remove the sign by grabbing it by the wooden stake saved her life. As she just grabbed the sign and just ripped it apart right then and there, as had been done many times to many other signs before, the gun would have very likely gone off. Now, while the Circleville letter writer had terrified Mary and many others in the town before, this officially took things to another level, and investigators were now, finally, all over it. Whoever did this had tried to cover their tracks by scratching off the gun's serial number. But investigators were able to piece it back together and find the gun's owner. The man told investigators he had just sold the gun 3 months earlier to his work supervisor, who said they needed protection because their family was being harassed. Are you ready for this? It turned out that this coworker who had just purchased the gun was none other than Ron's brother-in-law, Paul Freshour. As a refresher, Mary and her husband Ron enlisted the help of Ron's sister Karen and his brother-in-law Paul. Paul was the one who sent the letters to Mary's coworker, the male bus driver that they suspected might be the Circleville letter writer. Mary and Karen also went on vacation together, and later that night, Ron got the call from the Circleville writer and went out to confront them, which led to his fatal car wreck. After which, Paul was incredibly vocal about his belief that there was foul play involved, and even accused the sheriff of being corrupt for not investigating the crash further. In the years since Ron's death, Paul and Ron's sister Karen had divorced. When investigators pulled Paul's work records, they saw that he called out sick the day that Mary found the sign about her daughter and Superintendent Massie, the one that had the gun booby-trapped on it. They also found that Paul's workplace, a brewery, had all the materials that were used to make the booby trap. When Paul was questioned about this, he was adamant that while he had recently purchased that gun, that someone else had recently stolen it from his garage. But the sheriff wasn't convinced, particularly after Paul agreed to handwriting tests that, when compared to the Circleville letter writer, there were some striking similarities. Paul also failed a polygraph test. The Circleville sheriff confronted Paul with all of this, which the sheriff says led to Paul confessing. Now keep in mind, this was the early 80s, so law enforcement did not routinely record their interviews. So this confession is not recorded. So in this case, all we have is the sheriff's description of Paul's confession. And unfortunately for all of us, it seemed Paul never mentioned anything that would explain a possible motive. Paul was charged with attempted murder of his former sister-in-law, Mary. He pleaded not guilty and was released on bond shortly thereafter. After his release, Paul admitted himself to a mental health facility and then entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Court-appointed forensic psychiatrists found that Paul was mentally fit to stand trial. And shortly before his trial started, he withdrew his insanity plea. He now claimed that the sheriff was lying about everything, specifically him making that confession. In addition to Paul now fiercely denying having anything to do with the booby trap or any of the Circleville letters, he said that if he had been behind the booby trap, he would have never used a gun that he knew could be traced back to him. Now keep in mind, Paul was only actually being tried for the booby trap incident. He wasn't charged with writing any of those threatening letters, but they were still used as evidence against him. And even the handwriting expert hired by Paul's own defense attorney apparently testified that they believed Paul's handwriting indicated he was the Circleville letter writer. When Mary took the stand, she told jurors that she never suspected her former brother-in-law of being behind the letters, particularly because Paul had seemingly tried to help Mary and her late husband Ron stop the letters. And don't forget, Paul was very vocal about believing that Ron's death involved foul play and pushed very hard for the sheriff's department to investigate it as such. But here's a crazy tidbit. Mary apparently did remember a conversation she had with her sister-in-law and Paul's ex-wife Karen, where Karen mentioned how before she divorced Paul, she found letters floating in their toilet that she said she thought resembled the handwriting of the Circleville letter writer. I know, there are so many questions about that one that I wish I could ask, but that's all the details we have on that. Meanwhile, Paul's defense team told jurors that Paul, a highly educated man with a well-paying job, would never risk it all in order to try to kill his former sister-in-law. Again, there was no clear motive whatsoever. And on the day of the incident with the booby trap, a day that Paul had called out of work, he claimed it was because he had work to do around the house, and multiple people testified, saying that they saw Paul at his home that day. But ultimately, the jury didn't buy it. Paul was convicted of the attempted murder of his former sister-in-law, Mary. Paul was sent to prison, and the town of Circleville thought their letter nightmare was over. But, of course, it wasn't. It wasn't long into Paul's prison stay that Circleville residents started getting letters in that all-too-familiar, thick, blocky handwriting. Investigators believed that Paul was somehow smuggling the letters out from behind bars, so he was placed into solitary confinement, strip-searched often, and his mail was very, very closely monitored. And yet, even after all of that, the letters didn't stop. Investigators then shifted their theory that it must be a copycat, though they also knew there were stunning similarities between the early letters and the new ones that seemed difficult for someone else to replicate. Now, after serving 7 years, Paul was eligible for parole. Before his hearing, the letter writer doubled down and sent more letters than ever before. Members of the parole board were not convinced that Paul wasn't somehow involved in these new letters, so his parole was denied. A few days after the parole hearing, Paul received a letter himself. It read, "Now when are you going to believe you aren't getting out of there? I told you 2 years ago, when we set them up, they stay set up. Don't you listen at all? No one wants you out. No one. The joke is on you. Ha ha." Looking back at archived news stories on the case, it's clear that the Circleville sheriff never stopped believing that Paul was the culprit. The sheriff believed that Paul was somehow pulling off an elaborate scheme of having the letters continue to go out while he was in solitary confinement. He thought Paul was doing this, of course, in an effort to gain publicity and say, look, it really isn't me. The real perp is still out there. And Paul, meanwhile, always maintained his innocence to reporters. In the early 90s, the popular crime show Unsolved Mysteries decided to pursue the case. And just before production began, a letter was sent to their headquarters. In the all-too-thick, blocky writing, the anonymous letter read, "Forget Circleville, Ohio. Do not hurt Sheriff Radcliffe. If you come to Ohio, you sickos will pay. Signed, the Circleville writer." Ultimately, that would be the last known letter that the Circleville writer ever sent. Now, producers were not deterred by this. It probably made them want to cover it even more, and they went ahead with the story as planned. Now, while Mary and Paul's ex-wife Karen declined to be interviewed, Paul agreed to sit down with producers. This after Paul was granted parole for serving 10 years behind bars. Now let's dig into Paul's claims that he was framed by the real Circleville writer. Some people suspected the real culprit was a relative of Superintendent Gordon Massie, but it seems there really wasn't much credibility to this. Others speculated that if anyone was going to frame Paul, it would be his ex-wife Karen, who, remember, was the sister of Ron, Mary's husband, who died when supposedly going to confront the Circleville writer. Some pointed to the fact that Paul and Karen were divorced shortly before the booby trap with the sign and the gun led to Paul, and that Paul was granted their home and custody of their child. After Paul was arrested, Karen got custody and got to move back into the family home. Journalist Martin Yant covered the case extensively. He said he's been able to review the case files and found some pretty significant unreleased information. About 20 minutes before Mary drove past the sign that had the booby trap attached to it, another bus driver had driven by the area and noticed a yellow El Camino parked in the spot where the sign was later found. The bus driver said there was a tall man with a heavy build and blondish hair, and he apparently turned away as soon as the driver passed him, seemingly trying to hide from her view. Now, that man did not match Paul's physical description at all, but reportedly did resemble Paul's ex-wife Karen's new boyfriend. There's no information out there that the new boyfriend drove an El Camino, but apparently, according to Martin Yant's sources, Karen's brother did, but I do not know if it was yellow. Now, I'd like to take note here that Karen was never actually considered a suspect by law enforcement, and it seems a lot of people really close to the investigation, really knowledgeable about the case, think that the concept that she may have tried to frame her ex-husband for this is simply ridiculous. But it seems that someone clearly wanted to make it seem that this was the case. You see, one of the Circleville letters was sent to the sheriff and flat out said, quote, "I set up Paul. I can't hardly live with it." And it was signed with Karen's name. So this suggested to some that the Circleville letter writer was trying to frame Karen for framing her husband Paul. And this is what stands out to me. The Circleville letter writer would occasionally sign the letters by people's names, specifically people that were considered obvious suspects, like the superintendent's relative for one. And other letters had been signed with the superintendent's name. So a lot of people thought this was the way of the real writer toying with people by signing the names of people who, again, would be natural suspects. Or another theory is that the writer was actually trying to frame them. And this might be the craziest part of the entire case. It is, in my opinion. While a lot of the focus of the Circleville writer was on Mary and this alleged affair between her and school superintendent Gordon Massie, it turns out there were other people in town that the writer had their eye on and seemed to know very intimate details about them. One letter accused the county coroner of being a child molester, and later on, the former coroner was charged with corruption of a minor and indecent exposure. And here's another rather chilling detail. Let's go back to 1980. The Circleville writer had been sending letters for 3 years at that point. That's when a 25-year-old elementary school teacher, Vicky Koch, goes missing. 30 days later, her body was found in a cornfield some 35 miles away from Vicky's home. Investigators classified her death as a homicide. And not long after, the Circleville letter writer began sending letters out about the case, claiming Vicky had been having an affair with a local attorney and was pregnant with their baby. The writer accused the attorney of killing Vicky in order to keep her quiet. And this part is highly disturbing. In one letter, the writer threatened to dig up a baby's bones and start mailing them to random people if Vicky's case wasn't thoroughly investigated, which they were investigating it, so whatever that means. And apparently, after that letter was sent, an infant's grave was dug up at a local cemetery, and letters with a white powder inside were sent to the sheriff around this same time. And the writer claimed the powder was ground up bones from an infant, but testing showed that the powder was not bones, which sounds good, sounds like a relief to some extent, until it turned out that the powder was poisonous. And let's not forget, an infant's grave was dug up. Now, some people out there think that there could have been truth to what the Circleville writer said about Vicky's case, but there's never been any evidence to back it up, including no evidence that Vicky was pregnant. And when you look up Vicky's case online, the most prevalent theory is that she was the victim of a serial killer. All this time later, though, Vicky's case is still unsolved and is Circleville's only cold case homicide. Now, going back to Paul, after he was released from prison, he continued to try to prove his innocence, sending extensive information to the FBI he hoped might exonerate him. In 2012, Paul died at the age of 70. Whether or not he was the writer behind the letters is still heavily debated. Now, the Circleville writer was active for 16 years, during which 1,000 letters were sent to various Circleville residents that appeared to be the work of the writer. Of these 1,000 letters, roughly 500 of them were found to be a match to Paul's handwriting by handwriting analysts. Now, it's not clear to me what the consensus was about the other 500 letters, but we know that half of them were linked to Paul, as well as the sign with the booby trap. Handwriting analysis as evidence is a fairly debated topic as well. Some people think it's reliable, other people say it's junk science. But journalist Marie Mayhew, who did a deep dive podcast on this case, What Remains, well, she revealed a bombshell about this case. She said that a dozen of the Circleville letters that were sent while Paul was in prison were found to have his fingerprints on them. But think about this. How is it possible that Paul touched those letters behind bars and then could manage to smuggle them out and have them postmarked in Columbus, Ohio? No one has ever been able to figure that out. This is one of those cases where, despite there being a lot of information, there are still so many questions and so many aspects that I know many people, myself included, would love more information on. For me, I'd really like to know much more about the letters that were being sent to other Circleville residents throughout the years, besides Mary and the school superintendent. Who all was the writer targeting? Did it seem that they were as obsessed with exposing other secrets the same way they were obsessed with exposing Mary and Massie's alleged affair? To this day, no one has ever officially been charged with being the writer behind the letters, and the case is considered closed by law enforcement. I will be thinking about this one for a while. Until next time, thank you for watching.